Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in our Land Managers Toolbox webinar and workshop series. This series will focus on a different topic each month, and the way we have this playing out is that we're going to have webinars on the first and third Tuesdays of each month, and then we're going to have an in-person workshop on the last Wednesday of each month. Each month's topic and webinar registration links will be posted to our Quail Forever in Arkansas Facebook page, and we will also be sending out emails with information on that month's topic and schedule. But for this webinar, we're going to be focusing on general wildlife habitat in the natural state. We're going to take a look at some of the common ecosystems that we see across our landscape, the wildlife that depend on them, and what we can do to restore these ecosystems. Today's speakers are myself, Jessica Cox. Sorry about the name. The account is under my boss's name. So my name is not Ryan Diener. My name is Jessica Cox. And I'm the Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist in Arkansas. I am in the Fort Smith area, and my coverage counties include Scott, Sebastian, Franklin, Logan, and Yell counties. I've been working with Quail Forever as a biologist since 2017. I recently transferred from the Harrison office. And that brings me to our next speaker. She's our newest Quail Forever biologist, Katrina Sims, and I will let Katrina introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Katrina. I'm here in the Harrison, Arkansas office. I'm also a farm bill biologist with Quail Forever, and I'm pretty new. I've only been here since about the middle of September, and I cover Boone, Carroll, Newton, Searcy, and Marion counties. So glad to be here with you guys and presenting tonight. So hopefully it all goes well. This is my first presentation, but I'm happy to be here.
All right, thanks, Katrina. So before we jump into our material, a few housekeeping things. So we will be having a question and answer segment at the very end of the presentation. So as we're going through these presentations, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And once we get through the presentations, we'll go through those questions in the order that we received them. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be put on our Quail Forever in Arkansas's YouTube page if you want to ever go back and watch it or recommend it to somebody who was not able to join us today. Again, this webinar will be a general overview of the common ecosystems we see here in Arkansas and how our wildlife utilize them. So there are definitely going to be topics and things that we're not going to cover in very fine detail, but those will be covered in future webinars. So if you're interested in anything specific, please stay tuned to our Facebook page to see when we're going to be having a webinar regarding those specific practices. And with that, we will begin. Stop my video. So I'd like to start with a brief discussion about who Quail Forever is and what exactly it is we're trying to accomplish here in Arkansas and also across the United States. So Quail Forever is a nonprofit organization that started in 2005 as a branch of Pheasants Forever. And our mission, Quail Forever and Pheasants Forever, is to conserve quail, pheasants, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, education, and conservation advocacy. As you can see, I have habitat improvements and education in bold because as biologists, these are the two aspects of our mission that Katrina and I really focus on with our work. So what do these habitat improvements and education look like on the ground? So habitat improvements that we focus on include grassland restoration, forest land restoration, and the management of native inclusive and wildlife friendly working lands. We also work on other ecosystem restoration projects such as wetlands and glades. The unique thing about our job, however, is that these habitat improvements are mostly conducted on private lands. So these are places where landowners have actively made that decision to improve and enhance their natural ecosystems. So the second aspect of our job is public education and outreach. And this is important because it allows us to provide valuable information to the public, which in my opinion, understanding why the work is needed and why we're doing the work is just as important as doing the work itself. Workshops and webinars like these also help us to achieve that mission. We also provide technical assistance for landowners, such as conducting site visits and writing wildlife management plans. And we assist in data collection and monitoring efforts across the state for both wildlife and vegetation. And we also work closely with our Quail Forever chapters across the state to help raise funds and awareness for habitat restoration projects. So with that, we'll move into the focus of this webinar. So Arkansas can best be described as a state of transition. We're fortunate enough in Arkansas to have a variety of ecosystems within our state, and each of these ecosystems really transitions from one to another across the landscape. So we'll be breaking this presentation into two sections, covering grasslands and forest lands. This table shows the general distinction between each of the dominant grassland and forest land sites that we commonly see in Arkansas, moving from virtually treeless areas to areas really dominated by trees and other woody vegetation. So I want to run through each of these so that as you hear us mention these terms, whether prairies, savannas, woodlands, closed canopy forests, as you hear us mention these terms, you kind of have a better understanding of what exactly it is we mean when we say this. So let's start by looking at our grassland ecosystem. So these ecosystems can be divided into prairies and savannas. Prairies are areas that are dominated by grasses and forbs with very few, if any, trees. So if you look at the information in this graph, the canopy cover and the basal area are going to be less than 10% in these areas. So that just means very few trees, a lot of sun. So we're going to see a lot of sun-loving species growing in these areas. From our prairies, we then transition into our savannas. So these areas, while still dominated by our grasses and forbs, are going to have more trees than our prairies. So the canopy cover for a savanna is going to be on average 10 to 30%, with a basal area of 10 to 40. And basal area, before I continue, basal area is a measure of the tree density in an area. So the higher the basal area, the higher the tree density is within an area. So from our savannas, we transition into our woodlands. And it is also here that we transition from our grasslands into our forest land ecosystem. So woodlands are areas where, while there are still grasses and forbs present, we start to see more woody growth. So more trees, more shrubby cover. It is also here, as well as within our savannas, that we do start to see a greater diversity in flora and fauna as well. So our plants and animals. And then from woodlands, we will move into our closed canopy forest systems. Unfortunately, these areas are what make up the majority of our forest lands in Arkansas today. And while they certainly do have their place here in our great state, that abrupt transition that we often see from open grasslands or pasture land to a closed canopy forest system really leaves out these other vital transition zones that a lot of our wildlife require for part or all of their life cycles. So kind of now that we have a better understanding of some of the vocabulary that we're going to be using frequently throughout this presentation, let's jump into our discussion on grasslands. So what are grasslands? Grasslands are generally defined as large areas of relatively flat open land that are predominantly covered in grasses with scattered shrubs and few to no trees. So as we said before, prairies and savannas make up our grasslands here in Arkansas. So as you can see, the picture on the left shows the Cherokee Prairie Natural Area that's located in the Arkansas River Valley area. So that's near Charleston. There's no trees here. There's very little woody vegetation, if any, and the flat landscape is dominated by grasses and wildflowers. We often hear them referred to as, maybe a sea of grass or flowers. I've heard that reference a lot when talking about prairies. Then looking at the picture on the right, we see a Western Oak savanna. This Western Oak savanna is located in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and is a project being taken on by the University of Arkansas for a savanna restoration project. As you can see in this picture, there's significantly more trees than that on the left, but the trees are spread out enough so that the grasses and wildflowers are still able to have a dominant presence within this landscape. So in Arkansas, the two most common prairie types we're going to see are going to be tall grass prairies and blackland prairies. So we'll take a look at a map showing their location in the next slide. But tall grass prairies are characterized by tall grasses and a large diversity of wildflowers. In Arkansas, we do receive enough annual rainfall to support taller growing species like our big blue stems, eastern gamagrass, unlike our short grass prairies that we find further west. However, the droughty soil conditions of these sites and the presence of periodic fire are what maintain these open conditions within our grasslands. The shrub and tree species that are present are going to be scattered, and those species are going to be well adapted to, or they're going to be more fire resistant than other native species. These areas are also known for their often rich topsoil, which, however, did lead to the exploitation of these areas for agricultural and urban development. So next, let's look at our blackland prairies. So these prairie remnants are isolated to the southwest corner of the state. They are characterized by their black alkaline soils and the chalk outcroppings often associated with them. Blackland prairies host a large diversity of plants and animals that are specifically adapted to these blackland sites. So if we travel across our prairies, we'll slowly start to see that transition into our savannas. And that is, it's not usually a very abrupt transition, but our savannas are normally going to be located along the edges of our prairies. These areas, as we discussed before, are still dominated by grasses and forbs, but it is here that we begin to see more trees. Again, though present, they are spread out far enough so that enough sunlight can reach the ground. White oaks and shortleaf pines are common species found in these areas because they tend to be the most fire resistant of our native tree species. But one key characteristic of a savanna, however, is the presence of what are known as open grown oaks. And we'll be looking at a picture of one of these open grown oaks here in the next couple of slides. But these oaks will be large with low growing limbs that branch out wide. And because of the drier conditions of these sites, fire was much more intense and was able to keep woody growth to a minimum, allowing what few trees did survive the fire to grow without competition from neighboring trees. So they really didn't have to compete with each other for those resources or space. And we often see these zones on the south and west facing slopes of hills and mountains also, because those sites receive more sunlight and remain drier, meaning that fire would have been able to burn more intense through those areas. And again, here we begin to see an increase in plant and wildlife diversity. So the shaded areas of our savannas did provide adequate conditions for our more shade tolerant species, while the openness of the canopy also allowed for some more of our sun loving species to thrive as well. And therefore, with an increase in plant diversity, we also see an increase in the diversity of wildlife that utilize these areas. So here's a map of Arkansas that shows the locations of our Arkansas grasslands with some pictures from some of the more common sites that you might be familiar with. So if we start in the northern portion of the state, that's what's known as our Springfield Plateau. And within that Springfield Plateau, we have Baker Prairie. So Baker Prairie is located in Harrison. It's the last 71 acres of a prairie ecosystem that once spanned thousands of acres across the northwest portion of the state. Moving a little bit further south, we run into the Arkansas River Valley Plains. So Cherokee Prairie, Flanagan Prairie, and Mazard Prairie are all located in this area. Moving a little bit further east, we have the Grand Prairie and the Mississippi Alluvial Plain. And then finally moving down into the southwest corner of the state is where we find our Blackland Prairie. So Tierra Noir is located here. And it's a really great example of the beauty of our Blackland prairies. And while I don't have a map showing the distribution of Arkansas savannas, again, they are commonly found along the edges of our prairies and on those southwest facing slopes, as we discussed earlier. So if we look back at the previous map of our grasslands, if you see the outline of the prairie, so our savannas would have been along the borders of those prairie lands. So those would be the transition zones, which our savannas would then transition into our woodlands, which would then transition into our more closed canopy forest systems. And as we can see from the map, this map of the Grand Prairie that's shown in the middle of your screen. So the light green area on this map is going to be our prairie grassland areas, and then the darker green color is going to be our forest and savanna that surround these prairies. So this is a better example, although not of the entire state. This is specifically for the Grand Prairie, but it's a good indicator to show you just how those transition zones move with one another. However, you'll notice that within the prairie, we do find wet areas, so whether that be rivers, creeks, streams, and other wetlands, such as in the case of the Grand Prairie, there's several bayous that run through the prairie. In those areas, we're going to see denser tree conditions because fire would not have been able to burn as intense, obviously, through wetter areas. So it's in those areas as well, scattered throughout the prairie, that we'll also find our savannas and woodlands and even some of our closed canopy forest systems. So if we look at the picture on the left side of the screen, this is a savanna that's found in the Arkansas River Valley near Fort Chaffee. So as you can see, there's still a lot of grasses, there's still a lot of wildflowers growing, but we see a lot more trees than we did in our prairie setting. And the picture on the right is an example of one of those open grown oaks that I mentioned earlier. That's a key characteristic of our savannas. So when assessing sites to determine proper management, we often look for signs like this that'll let us know kind of how that area would have looked historically. So as you can see in this tree, it has very low growing limbs that branch out very wide. So as other trees start to encroach in these areas, the trees will actually start to abort these lower limbs, which we can often still see as like large knobs or scars near the base of the tree. So if you're ever walking through the woods and you see these really scattered large oaks that have these big knobs or scars near the bottom, that's a pretty good indication that that site was at one point in time much more open and savanna-like than its current enclosed condition. So now that we've discussed kind of what grasslands are, let's take a look at why grasslands are important. So besides providing habitat for wildlife, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly, grasslands do provide many other ecological functions. So they provide erosion control, they improve and maintain our water quality, and they greatly aid in carbon sequestration. Plants that grow in these areas also provide species for horticultural trade and medicinal purpose as well. So, purple coneflower is used in heart medication, witch hazel is used as an antiseptic, and elderberry, which is a native shrub, is used to improve immunity. So these plants can also be used in ecological restoration projects and for biofuel production. So switchgrass is one of our native grasses that is used for biofuel production. In addition to this, grasslands also provide just a beautiful place to visit. So especially over the last couple of years, we're definitely seeing an increase in the number of people trying to get outdoors and explore nature, and these areas provide a great place to do that. And finally, grasslands did play an important role in our human history as well. So obviously, while these ecosystems have been greatly exploited, many of our cities, towns, and agricultural centers were built around these areas. So now let's take a look at some of our wildlife that utilize grasslands for either all or part of their life cycle, and how it is that our grasslands provide for these needs. So let's start with our mammals. So common mammals you might find within our grasslands include white-tailed deer, squirrels, rabbits, field mice, etc. The native grasses and forbs that make up our grassland are responsible for providing that forage, for providing the nesting and brood rearing and escape cover that these species require. The woody growth, the native shrubs, and the mast-producing trees like our oaks also provide significant forage for these species. Next, we'll look at our avian friends and how they utilize our grasslands. So there are an estimated 160 species of birds that utilize grasslands across the U.S. But some common types you'll find in Arkansas include bobwhite quail, wild turkey, woodpeckers, waterfowl such as ducks and geese, and raptor species like hawks, eagles, falcons, owls. They all utilize these sites. Those native grasses within these ecosystems provide nesting site for our ground nesting species such as quail and turkey. And their structure also provides access to bare ground, which allows for these species to easily navigate their environment. Mast producing trees and like oaks that produce acorns provide nutrient-rich forage from nuts and insects that are also attracted to these. And the trees also provide nesting and perching sites for these species. Den trees, which are large living trees that have the big holes in them or the large cavities, and snags, which are standing dead trees, provide nesting, shelter, and foraging sites as well. So looking at some of our insects that we mentioned earlier that depend on our grasslands, so you'll commonly see butterflies, bees, moths, and grasshoppers, beetles, just to name a very few. There are probably way too many insects to count that utilize our grasslands. Again, the native grasses that grow in these areas provide that right structure that many of these insects need in order to access bare ground. So for example, many of our native bee species are solitary ground nesters, which means that they need to have access to bare ground in order for them to create their nesting sites and their overwintering sites. Wildflower diversity equals greater insect diversity, and because of this, and because we have most of our native insect species are specialists, meaning that they specialize or require specific plants for themselves or their young. And last but not least, we have a plethora of reptile and amphibian species that dwell in our grasslands, snakes, turtles, lizards, salamanders, frogs, again, just to name a common few, also rely on the diversity that our grasslands provide. The insects that we find in our grasslands provide a reliable food source for many of these species, and the species in turn provide food for many of our mammal and bird species. So to briefly recap and kind of look specifically at what these grasslands provide overall, let's take a look at the main habitat components that we find in grasslands that our wildlife will use. So first of all, they have the right structure, and that is that native grasses grow in upright clumps across our grasslands, unlike fescue and Bermuda that grows more like a thick carpet. So you can see in the pictures on the right, Bermuda is really thick, so is fescue, and it's really hard for our wildlife to navigate that. And then if you look at the picture to the right of that, you have our native bluestem, and as you can see, it grows in tall clumps, and there's a lot of bare ground and space in between each plant. So these bare grasses also provide adequate shelter and protection from the elements and predators. Forage is another habitat component that we need. So the seeds, flowers, nectar, masts, and other wildlife species found within our grasslands provide nutrient-rich forage that is required for our grassland species to thrive. Nesting sites are critical to ensuring that our wildlife populations are able to reproduce and raise their young into sexual maturity. So the native grasses, again, with the structure, how our native grasses grow and our trees and shrubs will provide that component for nesting and brood rearing sites. And then escape, cover, and shelter is another critical component. So as we've seen, our grasslands, as with any ecosystem, really rely on a well-balanced food chain to maintain diversity. So we want to make sure that we're not disrupting that food chain and that we help to maintain that balance. So this means that we need those species to be present as a food source, but we also need to make sure that they have ample escape habitat so that some of them will survive to maturity. So now let's take a look at what's happened to our grasslands. So over the last several decades, we have seen a drastic decline in many of our wildlife species. We've also seen a drastic decline in grassland acres across the state. These two phenomena are directly related to one another. So as we lose our grasslands, so too then do we lose the diversity of wildlife that are dependent on these ecosystems. So the conversion to agricultural lands and urban development have played a major part in the destruction of our grasslands. Many areas that were once sprawling prairies full of wildlife and wildflowers have now been converted into non-native and oftentimes invasive species for livestock grazing and hay. Overgrazing and inadequate management have also destroyed any potential habitat that these areas might otherwise have had. In some parts of the state, we've seen our grasslands being converted into row crop farms. This edge-to-edge row cropping destroys many of those habitat components that we just discussed. And the overuse and misuse of herbicides and other pesticides have also led to the decline of many native insects and pollinator species. It's also led to the growing number of herbicide-resistant plant species that are non-native and often invasive. Soil disturbing practices such as tilling have damaged our soil and destroyed the native seed bank. And as we mentioned before, many of our urban and agricultural areas were developed on grasslands due to their flat terrain, good topsoil, and access to resources. For example, the city of Fort Smith is built on what used to be tall grass prairie in the Arkansas River Valley Plains. Another large contributor to the decline is a lack of prescribed fire. So fire is what maintains the open conditions of our grasslands, and without it, undesirable invasive woody species are able to take hold. So eastern red cedar is a great example of this. Though they're native to Arkansas, we would historically have only found eastern red cedar in areas where fire would not have burned as intensely, such as rocky outcroppings or in thicker closed canopy forests. Now we find these species scattered throughout what should be open grasslands or glades. So a lack of public education has also created problems for our grasslands. Misinformation and a let it grow mentality have prevented proper management of these sites. In addition, campaigns such as the original Smokey Bear, Only You Can Prevent Forest Fires, which now they've changed the slogan to Only You Can Prevent Wildfires now, led to a fear of fire within the general public. And invasive species that are being introduced as ornamentals are also wreaking havoc, as they often spread into other areas and are difficult to control. Bradford pear is a great example of a tree that was planted because of its early blooming period and its pretty white flowers, but it is now taken over in many areas and it provides little to no benefit for our wildlife or our pollinators. So proper education and outreach can go a long way in protecting these sites. And then before we jump into the last little bit of our discussion on how can we protect and restore our grasslands, I wanted to briefly mention one other grassland ecosystem that we commonly find here in Arkansas, and these are our glades. So glades are often areas within our forest lands, often on top of steep hills and mountains and on south and west facing slopes. There are 5 different types of glades here in Arkansas, but they're distinguished by their underlying rock types that are present. So for example, many of our glades in the northern part of the state are called dolomite glades because dolomite is the dominant rock type found in that area. They're characterized by shallow, rocky soils and often have exposed bedrock. Grasses and wildflowers thrive in these open conditions, whereas trees and shrubs have a harder time growing here due to the shallowness and rockiness of the soil. These forest openings, as they're often referred to as, were maintained with fire, as are our other grassland ecosystems. But these areas, unlike prairies, these areas are unique in the fact that they're almost little micro desert ecosystems here in Arkansas. So they're absolutely fascinating. We often find drought tolerant species like prickly pear on these sites, as well as coneflowers, blazing stars, and the rare Missouri bladderpot. We also see wildlife such as the eastern collared lizard, tarantulas, painted buntings, prairie warblers, and even our quail and our turkey and our deer heavily utilize these sites. Most of our glades here in Arkansas that have been degraded and overrun with eastern red cedar and other woody species because of a lack of fire. So many of the cedar thickets that you may see when you're walking through the woods are actually degraded glade sites. So now we're going to go into what we can do to protect and restore our grasslands. So the first thing we can look at doing is doing native habitat development planning. So planning is a critical part in any project, but having a wildlife management plan that's written by a biologist that details exactly what your goals and objectives are, what you have and what you need to do, is critical. And then always remember adaptive management. We're going to be repeating those words quite often during this presentation. But adaptive management is management that's based on the current conditions of the site. The next thing that we can look at doing are planting native grasses, forbs, and shrubs. So in order to properly establish our native grasses, we need to ensure that we have done adequate site prep. Most of the time that's done with herbicide applications, and the herbicide that's going to be used is going to be dependent on the species that is growing there at the time. But we want to ensure that we have good seed to soil contact, and that we try to get rid of the undesirable and invasive species as much as possible before we plant, because our natives, the first year, they don't grow very much after being planted, so they are very easily outcompeted. So we want to try to reduce that competition as much as possible. We want to plant only native species that are adapted to the site. So just because a plant is native to Arkansas doesn't necessarily mean that it's adapted to the site where you're trying to plant it. There are plants that grow in South Arkansas that would not do well in the highlands of the Ozark Mountains. So we definitely want to make sure that we're planting to the ecoregion that they're native to. We want to plan for optimum diversity and year-round forage. So the more species you have, the more wildlife you can support. And we want to make sure that what species we do have out there, we have some blooming all throughout the year to provide that year-round forage for our wildlife. Also, by establishing shrubby cover or downed tree structures for wildlife. So downed tree structures are basically kind of like brush piles without all the dirt and debris in them. But if you were to cut down some trees and kind of pile them in layers within an area in about a 30 by 50 block, that will provide that protection and escape cover that many of our wildlife utilize. And then manage the site. So again, that adaptive management. So this is definitely not a put it on the ground and walk away type of situation. We really have to manage these sites continuously as long as we own the property, as long as we're allowed. And prescribed burning is going to be important for all of our restoration projects, but just making sure that we have a prescribed burn plan that outlines the goals and objectives, outlines when and under what weather conditions we need to burn the unit, fire breaks and safety. Looking at doing a prescribed burn as part of the site prep for these native plantings, we definitely want to utilize prescribed fire whenever possible. But as far as managing these sites, we can use dormant season burns or growing season burns. So dormant season burns usually occur from November through March, and those are really to clean up thatch and debris from previous year's growth. And then our growing season burns, which we usually do from July through October, can help to promote our forbs. If our grasses are getting too thick, we can use a growing season burn to help set back those grasses and promote wildflower growth, and then to help knock back woody growth. So any cedar trees or other woody vegetation that's starting to creep into our grasslands, a growing season burn does a great job of keeping that stuff knocked back. And again, this adaptive management. So plan your prescribed fire based on the current conditions. So if you're wanting to set back your grasses, use a growing season burn. If you're just needing to do a cleanup and to clean up some thatch, do a dormant season burn. And we also interchange these throughout the management cycle. So with that, I will turn it over to Katrina to give you all a little discussion on our forest land.
Alrighty. So I'm going to kind of go over the different forests that we have here in Arkansas. Some of the information might be a little bit about kind of the same things that Jessica talked about as far as the burning and some of the management, but a little bit different. So first off is our forest here. We have two pictures of more of our woodlands. So they are a little more dominated by trees than your savannas are. So they still have a good amount of forbs and grasses growing in them, just a little bit higher percentage of trees in them. But like I said, that canopy is open enough to still allow enough sunlight to the ground that we can still get some grasses and forbs. And with that, we're going to kind of move on to the different forest types that we have and kind of break it down a little bit more for you guys. I don't know if it's letting me move to the next slide, Jessica. Oh, there it goes. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that, guys. My computer's being a little slow. So down here is that kind of table you guys seen earlier. So we have our woodlands and then we have our closed canopy forests. So like I was saying, on your woodlands, they have a high percentage of trees, but they still have a good amount of grasses and forbs. Whereas when you have your closed canopy forest systems, and they're mostly dominated by trees with a little bit of vegetation on the ground, but not much. Mostly you're going to see a lot of leaf litter and not much really growing on the ground, just because there's no sunlight reaching the ground floor. And so now we're going to move to the next slide, just break it down a little farther. And so on this slide here kind of has the different forests that we have. So here is a oak woodland here on your left, this far left picture. And as you can see, there's some, you got some oak trees here, and you still have a good amount of sunlight reaching the forest. So you have all this growth. This here in the middle is one of our bottomland hardwood forests. So it's more of a closed canopy forest system. And they're usually found in areas along rivers or streams. They can periodically flood throughout the year. So this kind of dirt area you can see here is probably where it was flooded earlier. And you maybe have some sedges or rushes growing in the back, and they're more of your wetland species type plants. And they're also, you can see how thick it is in there. You couldn't really navigate through that very easily. And that's just because your canopies are really dense and thick. And then over here on the far right, looks like we have a pine woodland area. So a bunch of pine trees. Looks like it's probably going to be some shortleaf pine. And it, like I said, still open canopy. So you can still get a lot of mid-story growth and forbs and grasses on the ground. I'm trying to move to the next slide. I don't know if it's, might just be a little bit of delay.
Yeah, it's not moving yet.
Is it working? Sorry, guys. I'm trying to go to the next slide for you, but it's being very slow. Can you switch it on your side or something? Is it working?
I'll stop the remote control and just tell me when you want to move to the next slide, and I'll move you through.
Okay, yeah, because I don't know why it won't work from my side.
Okay.
So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So here we're going to talk a little bit more about the different types of woodlands that we have. So we kind of have three types here. We have just our hardwood woodlands. So that's more of your white oak dominated with a little bit of hickory mixed in. And these are going to be more on your south facing slopes because they, generally get more sunlight and they're a little bit drier and they burn a little bit better and a little hotter, and white oak species or more resistant to fire. So you're going to have a higher percentage of those. And also on your white oak, they are your preferred oak tree. They're longer lived than your red oaks. And white oaks have a lower, for the acorns, for your wildlife, they have a lower level of tannins in them, which is just a compound that makes them bitter. And a lot of wildlife will actually seek out your white oak acorns over the red oaks because they're not as bitter to them. Then the next type of woodland that we have is your pine woodlands. Here in the northwest part of the state, we have shortleaf pines. We do have loblollies that are native to Arkansas. They're just not in this part of the state. Historically, this part of the state burned quite a bit, and the shortleaf pine is a little more resistant to fire than our loblolly. So the loblolly just wouldn't have been able to survive here very well like the shortleaf pine have. And then the third kind of woodland type system that we have is a mix of your hardwoods and pines. And that'll just be a mix of your oaks, pines, maybe a few hickories in there, but very few. And those sites would have just been kind of, depending on which one was more dominant, the pines or the oaks would have depended on how often it burned and how hot it burned. And these can be, your woodlands could be surrounded kind of like these are moving from like your savannas up to your woodlands, and then you're going to move into your closed canopy forest. And we have two different types of closed canopies here in Arkansas. We have just your dominated hardwood forest, those are going to be more on your north and east facing slopes because those sites are, usually wetter. They don't receive as much sunlight. And in the closed canopy, they're going to, you're not going to hardly get any sunlight to the ground floor. You're not going to hardly see any vegetation growing on the ground, mostly just leaf litter, maybe some, dead trees that have fallen over. And then we also have the bottomland hardwood forests, and these are deciduous and evergreen forest wetlands that are along rivers and streams. They flood periodically throughout the year. They have species such as oaks, bald cypress, gums, water tupelos, and these trees have characteristics of flared trunks and aerial roots, or some people call them cypress knees. And in these areas, you're just going to have few grasses and forbs presence, and with a lot of shade tolerant, like mid-story species. You might have some rushes and sedges, which are kind of wetland grasses and forbs, maybe some buttonbrush in there. And it's just mostly leaf litter in these areas. And the closed canopy forest systems are kind of, we use here in Arkansas, they're what you see a lot. A lot of our forests have been mismanaged over the years, and they've really overgrown to more of a closed canopy, where historically and so anyways, but over the years, we've just kind of overgrown. We've overgrown, and we are into a state where we need to do a lot of management on our forests that we have here. We can go ahead and kind of move to the next slide, please. So on here, it's like kind of like, why are forests important? This kind of goes over some of the things that Jessica talked about earlier. They do provide a lot of habitat for a lot of wildlife that we have here, but on top of that, they prevent a lot of soil erosion. They improve our air quality, water quality, and they're just very important. You know, a lot of our houses are built out of lumber and all that good stuff. And they also provide a lot of economic income for touristy areas that have like national forests, so like the Ozarks or the Ouachitas, or if you're in different states, you got the Smoky Mountains and stuff like that. All those are really big forest systems that bring in a lot of tourism to the towns and communities that are around those areas. And they are just, you know, really aesthetically pleasing. You know, when we have a barren landscape with not really a lot of growing out here. So Ozarks are really pretty. So if we can move to the next one. And here we're going to talk about some of the mammals that, you know, our forests provide habitat for, and the other, you know, insects and birds and amphibians. So here in Arkansas, we do have a lot of bats that use our forests and our woodlands areas. Woodlands are actually better for bats generally because you have a higher population of insects using them, because you have that, you know, forbs and grasses on the forest floor, which insects like to utilize a lot more than just, you know, leaf litter and stuff. And also, if you're thinking of it as your bat, and if you're trying to move around in the forest and you're trying to echolocate, it's going to be a lot easier in a woodland where you have a few trees to navigate through instead of just a thick mat that, you know, you're going to be constantly trying to bump into something. So the more open the area for bats, the better. So those woodlands are a lot better than our closed canopy forest systems. We also, for a lot of our other birds that we have, for ground nesting birds or songbirds, those also are a lot more benefit than just closed canopy, whereas we do have other species that do rely on the closed canopies. So like here in this picture of the insects, we have a Luna moth, and they tend to be more of a closed canopy insect. They lay their larvae on host plants, and a lot of the trees they use for the host trees they use are, you will only find in closed canopies. So things like birch, beech, cherry trees. And so, and then you also have your reptiles and amphibians, and you will find those in woodlands, but you find those a lot more in your closed canopy systems, because those areas are more moist. You have a lot of leaf litter and, you know, decaying, you know, trees that have fell over, and so you're always going to find snakes and salamanders and all those good things underneath, up underneath all those leaves and, you know, debris in moist areas. So we can go ahead and move on. And so currently today, we have a lot of issues and a lot of things that have been happening to our forests. So we've lost a lot of forests to clearing for agricultural purposes, you know, grazing for cattle, commercial harvest for timber, and urban development. And then a lot of the forests we still continue to have, we have issues with the mismanagement of them. So we've had a lack of prescribed fire over the last several decades. And so a lot of that stemmed from Smokey the Bear, which, you know, he's just out there trying to do a good job, but it said only you can prevent forest fire. Well, that got kind of created a culture of people fearing all fire, not just like wildfires, but all fire. And so for several years we had a, fire suppression where all fire was considered bad fire, so nothing got burned. And so now we are kind of in the state now that we're in here in Arkansas. We don't have a lot of wildfires. We still have a few, but our forests have grown up. They're over thick. They don't look good. They're not healthy. And then if you take, look out west, well, they have the conditions where they haven't, done any prescribed fire either. Well, they have, built up all this fuel over the years. Well, now they're in a really bad droughts. And so all this fuel is really dry. And so they're having these massive wildfires that are just taking out millions of acres, thousands of acres. And, if we would have never just completely stopped doing prescribed burning, they might not be that bad, because we would have been slowly building, burning that fuel, over, periodic fires over the years, instead of just not having a fire in that area for 50, 60 years. And then now it's just burning out of control and we can't stop it. And here in Arkansas, it's mostly where we had a lot of woodlands with a mix of closed canopy. Now we mostly have closed canopy with very few woodlands. And so we've lost a lot of our biodiversity. We've lost a lot of really good habitat that the animals could utilize as well. And so we just need to do a lot more better management of our forest that we have here. So the taking out the fire wasn't good. So we need to try. The last few years we've been doing a lot better. The Forest Service here is doing good, and the Forest Commission does a lot of burning here. And so we're getting kind of fire back on the ground, starting to do a little bit of management that way. And then another mindset is a lot of people think, well, let's just let it grow wild mentality. And, like, well, if I let it go, it's just going to grow back how it naturally used to be. Well, if you do that kind of thing, you're still going to have overgrown forests. It's not going to, grow back how it used to be, because historically, Indians and early European settlers used fire to manage the areas. The Indians Native Americans would burn it off when they would move around to their new hunting areas and follow the wildlife. They would burn stuff behind them, clean up the areas, keep the open areas clear and everything. And then there's even historic, accounts of wagon trains that went through the woodlands, through the forest, that could navigate very easily roads through the forest. Well, here nowadays we don't really have that kind of stuff. Like most forests, if you're going to try to walk through it, sometimes you have to beat your way through with a machete or something just to get through them. So it's really hard to navigate them. And then we just have these cookie cutter management plans that a lot of people are just kind of putting out there. And basically that's just kind of like, well, this is a forest, this management plan is going to do good for that. When in reality, you need to take a step back and look at what's happening at this site, this particular forest and area, and make a plan that is geared towards this particular site, not just a general one that kind of covers all forests. So next slide, please. And so now we're going to move on to protecting and restoring our forest lands and talk a little bit about that kind of stuff. So as Jessica was mentioning earlier, for grassland management plans, we also have forest management plans, and that's just going in, you hire a professional, or, seek assistance from a professional. Some of us, or do technical assistance for free. You don't have to hire somebody. Will come out there and do an assessment of your area, write your management plan based on, what kind of things we're seeing at the site, the species compositions we're seeing. You might have indicators that, well, this was a woodland instead of a closed canopy system, and stuff like that with your different species. Also, a lot of people around here that have forest land, sometimes they want to log it off or go in and do forest management. Well, they don't, contact somebody, and they just go in and do a lot of management. And then, you're not going to have a very good result sometimes, because, a lot of people don't know. So it's always good just to have somebody go in there and kind of take a baseline of what you got and what you want to get it to. And then also, you always want to keep in mind adaptive management. So, if I write a management plan today, or somebody does, in that site, you're going to do all these steps in the next 5 to 6 years. Well, in 5 to 6 years, that site's going to be completely different. Hopefully look a lot healthier. So you're going to have to write a new management plan to adapt to what you currently have instead of what you had 5 years ago. Next slide, please. And so some of the ways that we can go about improving our forests is through forest stand improvement. And so some of the methods that were used for that is prescribed fire, as Jessica was mentioning. So that can be a really good tool to use. And it's I don't, you could use it on a large scale, you know, for your whole forest. It doesn't have to be, you know, like little bitty spots or anything. And a lot of our closed canopy systems, you're going to be burning those in the winter months when it's dormant. So, you know, when it hasn't been raining or anything, it's a lot drier, just to reduce that leaf litter on the ground. Because in some places we can get some really, really dense leaf litter. And so, you know, just to reduce that, if it is a closed canopy system, if it is, you know, a woodland system or was a woodland system and you want to restore it back to that from a closed canopy, you're probably first going to go in there and you might run a fire through it at first, but then you're going to have to go in there and do a lot of thinning. So you're going to take out a lot of your undesirable species. So you might have a lot of cedar trees, locusts, you know, invasives, and maybe, you know, some undesirables like elms. And, you know, you just want to thin those out until you get to a basal area of a healthy one. So most of our forests here in Arkansas have a basal area that is over 100 basal area for an area, and that's just way too thick. You know, it's not even healthy for most wildlife in that, you know, in that state. They can't utilize it. It's, if it's hard for you to get through it, it's hard for the wildlife to get through it and use it. And then you don't have any food sources on the ground. Like you might have some, you know, hickory trees or oak trees in there, but it's even when it's that thick, your oaks are not going to produce as many acorns because they're all fighting, and your hickories are not either, because they're all fighting for sunlight. And so got to go in and do that management. You know, if you're going to set it back to a woodland, that's going to take a while. But then after you get all your trees kind of thin back to the basal area that you're looking for, then you can keep a periodic fire on it or your burn rotation, usually about every 3 years, every 3 to 5 years. And depending on if you're wanting more forbs and grasses, you might do, and you're trying to set back woody growth, you're going to burn, you know, like a growing season burn, set back those trees, you know, those saplings and stuff that are trying to come up. But then if you're just trying to burn off leaf litter, then you might just do a dormant season burn. And another thing about that is adaptive management. So just because, you know, you get in the mindset, oh, well, I got a closed canopy woodland, I'm just going to burn it, you know, in the dormant season because I'm just trying to reduce leaf litter. Well, in some areas, if you get it opened up enough, you might have a little bit of grasses and forbs. So you might want to switch up that time of year that you're going to burn it. You don't always have to burn it at the same time of the year every year, or every year that you're going to burn. Next slide, please.
And thank you, Sabrina. That was a great presentation. And then just to wrap up everything, just to go over some habitat best management practices in general, and these can be considerations used in both our grasslands and in our forest lands. But number one is definitely to grow native. So selecting native species that are native and again adapted to that site or adapted to that ecoregion. We want to make sure that we have the diversity and availability. So again, that greater plant diversity equals greater wildlife diversity, whether you're talking about in our forest lands or our grasslands. Wildlife and pollinators require year-round forage and nectar production. So making sure that those that wildlife has the availability of forage and nectar year-round is important. Creating usable space. So we want to make sure that those habitat components that we discussed are laid out in a way where the wildlife can readily use them and access them from one site to another. So for example, in Arkansas, I know specifically, I worked for years in the Ozarks. One big thing that we were seeing an issue with was really habitat fragmentation. So we would have great areas of native grasses and flowers that were great for our wildlife to utilize, but they were surrounded by unmanaged forest lands. So these closed canopy forest lands that provided nothing of use for these wildlife, but it also made it hard for them to travel between patches of good habitat. So we really want to create a usable space where wildlife can easily move through these areas from one place to another. And then, as I mentioned before, that continuous management. So this is not a put it on the ground and walk away type of situation. If this is something you're interested in doing, it is definitely a lifelong commitment, and that continual management is necessary to improve and maintain that quality habitat. And so end with one of my favorite quotes by Mr. John Muir. So when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So, you know, there's a lot that goes into native habitat management. We just briefly skimmed the surface of everything that goes into it. So I know that was a lot of information that we threw out at you tonight, but hopefully you'll tune into our other webinars where we are going to go more specifically into establishing these habitat components in much more detail. So there is a lot that goes into it, but if you're willing to take the time and to make the effort, it definitely will all come together at the end and create a beautiful landscape that, you know, not only our wildlife can use, but that we can enjoy for years to come. And with that, there is mine and Katrina's contact information with our coverage areas. There's also our Quail Forever in Arkansas Facebook page that if you haven't already, go ahead and give us a follow on there so you can see our upcoming webinars and workshops that we're going to have in this series. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing so we can go into our, let's see, open up this. So it looks like right now we don't have any questions in the chat box. So I'm going, we'll give everybody, we've still got a little bit of time left. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, feel free to type that into the chat box. Or, I mean, there's not a whole lot of us. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and just ask your question if you've got any. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions coming through and nobody has unmuted that I've seen to try to ask a question. So we will go ahead. Oh, what are the dates for the next meetings again? So these webinars are scheduled on the 1st and 3rd Tuesdays of each month. Because we just started in January, we only had this one for the month to kind of get us started. But we do have another one scheduled for February 1st. That's on a Tuesday. And we are going to have Jay Randolph, who is the golf course superintendent for the city of Fort Smith. He has been doing restoration work on the Mazard Prairie at the Ben Guerin Golf Course, and he's going to be giving a presentation on what they've been doing at the golf course to restore wildlife habitat and restore that native prairie. But if you follow us on Facebook, or if you've registered for this meeting, I have your email, and we will be sending out email notifications at the end of each month with the next month's topic and webinar dates. All righty. Well, with that, we will end the meeting. I will go ahead and stop the recording.